So, the topic of today's presentation is cheap things around Boston. And there are basically two parts to the presentation. The first part of the presentation that I do every single time is a little bit about cool things from around Boston. And then the second part of the presentation is actually the cheap things around Boston. I hope you'll stick around for the next presentation, maybe in a month or two, when we do premium things in Boston, or what I call dear things in Boston, things that are cool to do, but not that cheap. So that being said, I'm going to see if I can move the slide forward. And naturally it doesn't work. It worked fine just a few minutes ago. So let's try this again.
Can you try using the spacebar instead of the down button?
I will try. It is not working. Oh, there it is. Yay, thank God. This happens every single time. I have to scroll up. So, there's cool things from around Boston. Normally what I try to do is, in every single one of these presentations, talk about some historical things, hidden things that are around Boston that are great for people who are walking around to see, that are free. This is one that I've come across lately, the Boston Stock Exchange building. This was an 11-story building built in 1891 where the Boston Stock Exchange was held. This was actually the most important building in Boston, and the picture that you're looking in the upper left was the staircase inside that building. So this building was important because it was 11 stories high in a time before there was reinforced concrete. In order to make buildings high in those days, they had to make the base wide. So the base had to be like 12 feet wide of brick, and it got narrower and narrower as you went up, just to support the weight of the upper stories, right? The cool thing about this building, built in 1891, was they had electric light. They had telephones and telegraphs and stock tickers, and they had steam heat, which was a revolutionary type of heat. Wasn't invented in Boston, but it was promoted all around New England by a man named James Walworth, who invented the pipe wrench. It also had the Otis elevator. So this building went along on State Street until 1980, and when it was finally purchased to be demolished. But of course, a lot of people got upset about it being demolished. So the company that bought it kept the facade and the lanterns, which you can see here, and that staircase. That staircase was dismantled brick by brick and rebuilt in the lobby. You actually can't go up the staircase, it doesn't go anywhere unless you get special permission. Sometimes people who are getting married get their pictures taken on the stairs. They don't go anywhere, but they're very beautiful, and it's a cool thing that you can go and see in Boston for free. The Boston Bricks is a newer addition to the city. And what it is it was an art project that was installed between King's Chapel and Old South Church. And what I would like to point out is that that square block where King's Chapel is probably the most exciting and eclectic part in all of Boston. So much happened in that one block area that I could talk about it, just that area, for over an hour. You can stand on the street and turn 360 degrees and see something cool in every single direction. And the thing I'm pointing out today are these bricks. And this is Winthrop Street, which is a very small street that cuts between two areas of that plaza. And what has happened is they've replaced some bricks in the sidewalk with these bronze bricks that have different things about Boston carved into the bricks. And by people walking over them, the bricks are actually polished by their feet. Some of the bricks are funny. Some of the things that are shown are indicative of what's happened in Boston. This particular one shows that the sewing machine was invented here in Boston. It was not invented by Singer. He actually lost the patent to the man who invented it, whose name escapes me now, but it was invented here. There are pictures of monsters driving cars to make fun of Boston commuters. And this was put in the early 2000s. It's still there. You can see it's taken a little abuse just from this picture of this worn out brick. But if you go down there, it's quite interesting to try out the various bricks. There's about 100 of them. This is a very, very cool thing. The Church of the Covenant Tiffany Sanctuary. I really didn't even know about this. I've been doing tours for about 30 years, and I've only found this out in the past year. This was a congregational church built in 1867. It's on Newbury Street. And it was the highest building in Boston until 1915, when the Customs House was completed. The Customs House, by the way, was the third skyscraper built in America. Third building. To be a skyscraper, it has to be built with reinforced steel. I don't know if you know this, but the ships used to actually sail right up to the Customs House. Now it's like a mile to the water. It's all been filled in. In the 1880s, the pastor of the church, on a whim, purchased a Tiffany lantern from the Columbian exhibition in 1893, and he convinced his congregation to build a sanctuary around this lantern. So there are over 43 elements of art dedicated to showcasing this glass. And this, along with the Arlington Street Church, has the largest Tiffany glass collection in the world. If you're the type of person that likes Tiffany glass, and I don't know if you know this, but Tiffany glass is made up of 5 different kinds of glass, 3 of which Louis Comfort Tiffany invented himself. And it's very beautiful the way the light plays on it from the outside. It's well worth going to the Arlington Street Church, which we'll be talking about later, or to this sanctuary to check this out. The thing about this is that this is an active church, so if you do show up, there might be services going on. Interesting thing that both the Arlington Street Church and this church had their Tiffany windows attacked. In this case, in 2012, it was thieves that smashed one of the windows to break in and steal some computers. In the Arlington Street Church, it was right-wing demonstrators who didn't like that the church was promoting gay marriage. They threw a cinder block through one of the windows, and as a result, the church had to armor all the windows, which is actually pretty sad when you think about it. But I would highly recommend going to check out both places. Here's something really cool. You look up at your door in any institutional building and you see these door closers that prevent the door from slamming shut. These were invented in Boston by a man named L.C. Norton in 1872, and he invented them specifically for the Trinity Church. The Trinity Church in Copley Square has been named on the top 10 best buildings, most beautiful buildings in Boston since that list was started when the church was built. It is considered generally the most beautiful building in America. This was something that surprised the heck out of me. A couple of years ago, I happened to see the Glidden tour going by up in North Conway, New Hampshire. I didn't know what the Glidden tour was. I did some investigation only to find out that this guy Glidden and his wife in 1902 in a British car circumnavigated the globe, 49,000 miles. They drove around 39 countries in this car around the world. Now, let's think for a minute that the first transcontinental car ride in America was done in 1903 in a winter. Took over a month across the country because there were no roads across the United States back in those days. And these people circumnavigated the globe in 1902. Right? He was one of Bell's partners, Alexander Graham Bell, the inventor of the telephone. And we'll talk about this later, but Alexander Graham Bell was also the man who formed the Canadian Air Force. So Glidden, working with Bell, designated women as telephone operators because he felt that their voices were better for the phone than men's. He had the first long-distance phone call installed, and the Glidden tour is still held to this day, and they give you a cup at the end. It has to be for antique automobiles, and you really got to be into what you're doing because these automobiles take a beating. It's like a 100-mile tour through hills and around turns. And if you're not the type of person who likes to put miles on your antique vehicle, this is not the tour for you. Here in Boston was the first pilot licensing organization in the United States, started by our friend Glidden. It was originally for balloonists, even before planes came on the scene. But it provided the first licenses as a competence for flying. License number 1 went to Charles Curtis. Licenses 4 and 5 went to Orville and Wilbur Wright. And people say that oh, it was a slight against the Wright brothers. No, but no, it wasn't. It was because the names were listed alphabetically in those days, and there were only 6 people who had flying licenses. This became the NAA in 1923, which still exists and does a lot of ruling on aircraft usage. Boston licensed to the first female pilot in 1911, Harriet Quimby. She was a well-known journalist and critic for Frank's Illustrated newspaper. Frank Leslie's Illustrated newspaper started around the time of the Civil War and was very influential in changing America for the better. They were the ones that broke the swill milk scandal in New York in the 1870s, when the Tammany organization was providing poison milk and selling it as fresh milk. And it's one of the reasons that the USDA was invented. And she worked for that organization. She became interested in aviation, and after attending a Glidden Aero event in Belmont, and she promoted this for women. She tried to get more women into the sport. She was the first person to fly over the English Channel in an aircraft, and she had a great future for her, except that she died. She was the first female to ever die in an air crash in 1912. She was right here in Boston doing an air race outside Boston at the Squantum Air Base in Quincy, which is long gone. It's been gone since like 1960. It required the planes to fly as fast as they could to Boston Light and back again to Squantum at an altitude of 3,000 feet. She was using a French-made Blériot, which was a monoplane. When you think about it, it was a one-wing, not a biplane, in 1912, which was pretty radical. So after completing the race, they returned to the airfield, and for reasons that are still unknown to this day, the plane tipped over, and because people didn't have parachutes or seatbelts in those days, she and her passenger fell 1,000 feet to their death. So the interesting thing about this was the plane righted itself, and even without a pilot, it landed itself on the ground and crashed into a swamp. So, just as a matter of being aside, the first man killed in an airplane was Lieutenant Thomas Selfridge. He was in a plane with Wilbur Wright. The plane's propeller flew off. It was a 2-engine plane, and it cut up the plane and cut him up pretty badly and caused a crash as well. So, interesting trivia that happened in Boston. This I thought was very exciting, very interesting. Back at Squantum again, the first airfield in America run by a woman, and who that woman was Amelia Earhart. Amelia Earhart was in Boston acting as a social worker, but she loved to fly. And in order to get money to fly, she took a job running this airfield in Squantum. Squantum was a pretty important airfield in those days. It was started by Harvard University to fly gliders, and it evolved along the way. And during World War I, it was an important air base for float planes. So she stayed in Boston, she got some money, she worked at this airport, and when she got the money, she started her transatlantic flight, the first woman to cross the Atlantic Ocean. That's the end of the first part of the presentation, and now we're going to move over to the second part of the presentation, which are cheap things to do in Boston that are fun. I don't know how you can get cheaper than this, and some people would say you can't get better. But if you go, there are something like 17 breweries in Boston and the surrounding areas. Not all of them give tours, but many of them do. Sam Adams was the first to give tours of this brewery. It's in Jamaica Plain. It's in a very artsy area. It's actually free to go in, but they ask you for a donation. I think they actually donate the money to some charity. And you go through and they show you how to make the beer. And they have a little bar at the end where they give you some free beer as well. And then they put you on a shuttle, and they used to take you to Doyle's, but now Doyle's is gone, which is a major sin as far as I'm concerned, because Doyle's was Boston. I don't know where they take you to now. And with the COVID, obviously nobody's doing any of these things. But when the COVID is over, then you can return and take the shuttle, take the tour, and then take the shuttle to a local bar. There are companies, Boston City Brew Tours will take you to a number of breweries in a bus for about $80 a person. They take you around, they give you food, and they also take you to a bar at the end as well. But for $2, how can you beat it? This is the Trinity Church in Boston, which we were talking about earlier. it was the first building built by H.H. Richardson, who went on to great fame as an architect. It was built in 1872 after the Boston Fire, the Great Boston Fire. The Great Boston Fire destroyed the original church, which was also considered quite beautiful. And in this place was built on the gravesite of the old church, which was destroyed. So again, this is considered the most beautiful building in Boston. This picture does not do it justice. Right to the right of it, of course, is 200 Clarendon, which used to be called the Hancock Tower, the tallest building in Boston. And right behind it, you can see the old Hancock Tower with the little light that tells the weather on the top. Clear blue, steady blue, clear view. That's what that blue light means at the top of the Hancock Tower. Phillips Brooks was the original pastor of this church. He was the most famous pastor in America at that time during the Civil War. And he was the man who penned the words of the people, by the people, for the people. He was a friend of Abraham Lincoln, and Lincoln used these words in the Gettysburg Address. They do broadcast masses sometimes from this church on WBUR. And this church is on filled land. It sits on 10,000 piles of Maine fir, each one 100 feet long, without knots, and driven in by the steam-driven pile driver, which was invented in Boston just for this purpose. The admission in the tour is $3, and you can go into the church for free, but if you want to take the tour, it's $3, and they will show you all the wonderful things. They really do have some great services and musical programs in there, and the acoustics are phenomenal. This is my favorite cheap thing to do in Boston. This is the Swan boats. The Swan boats operate on the Swan Pond in the public garden. The public garden is the oldest park in America. It was built on filled land. The pond was made in the center, and there was a huge controversy about this park because a man named David Sears tried to convince the Boston City Council to build mansions around the park only for rich people. This is one time that the people won the battle and Sears was beaten down. So in 1877, a man by the name of Paget went to the opera in Boston and saw an opera called Lohengrin. And in that particular opera, which I have never seen, a swan takes the ballerina across the lake. And he decided to build some boats based on that opera. And these are the very same original boats run by the very same original family. It costs $3.50. In a busy city, in a busy, noisy city, this is the best thing you can do. It's quiet, it's comfortable, it's friendly, it's slow, it really slows light down. And you go around this little lake, it takes about 20 minutes, and I really can't say enough about it. Anytime I bring people to Boston, I try to bring them to the Swan boats. Boston Harbor Water Shuttle. Now, because of the COVID, the water shuttles are probably all going to be canceled next year. The MBTA in general is really taking a bad hit. But in the event that they're somehow saved, the water shuttle is just not a good idea for commuting. It's also a great way to take a trip around Boston for very little money. There is one shuttle that goes from Long Wharf to Charlestown Navy Yard for $3.50. You're on the boat for about 15 or 20 minutes. You go through Boston Harbor. It's a beautiful view of the city, of East Boston, of Boston Harbor, of the Navy Yard, of the Moakley Courthouse. Sometimes I take this ferry just for the fun of being on the ferry. And you can go up on the roof and just enjoy being outside on the harbor for $3.50. I don't think you could possibly beat it. They also sell all kinds of snacks and things on board too. Now there's also a ferry from Hingham to Columbus Park. Now you really want a good time. It's 45 minutes. They have all kinds of comfortable seats. You can sit inside or outside. They have all kinds of snacks and things. And sometimes they give they have somebody who will tell you what you're looking at in the harbor as you're going by. For the money, you're never going to get a better harbor tour for $9.75 anywhere. It really is marvelous. And because of COVID-19, all of this may be gone. Now at the bottom, you can see there's a water taxi too. The water taxi will take you to any one of 15 or 20 destinations on the harbor, The difference is the water taxi is not cheap at all. And so that's one of the reasons why I don't talk about it much. The Blue Hills Observatory. I have been going to the Blue Hills Observatory since I was 3 years old. It's on the top of the Blue Hills. It's the oldest weather station in the United States. It was built in 1884. It's made of stone and concrete. They are going to tear it down soon and rebuild it again because it's so old it's starting to fall apart. It is the highest elevation on the entire East Coast, 635 feet. Think about that for a few minutes, that this is the highest altitude within 10 miles of the coast from here to Georgia. It's pretty amazing. When you take the tour, they take you up to each one of those 3 windows, and something weathery is happening on every window, on every floor. This is where they make the weather, as Bill Murray said in Groundhog Day. I make the weather. They have all the computers and the satellites and all the machines, and they will show you and explain to you, and they'll tell you what the weather is going to be tomorrow and for the next week. And one of the most amazing things about this is they are still using instruments from 1884. The self-same instruments, the barometers and the hygrometers and some of the anemometers and things are the same instruments. They're behind glass. You can see them still working, and you can go on the roof and you can get a 360-degree view of the entire area. It's awesome. $4. How can you beat it? And when you're up there, don't forget to see the memorial to Ella Bazzanotti, my mother, contributed by our family when she died in 2012. It really is quite a thing to do. The Blue Hills area in general has so much going on that, again, I could spend another hour talking just about that. Cars are not allowed up here. You have to hike to the top, get some exercise. It's good for you. This is another one of my favorite places that when I bring people to Boston, I try to take them to this. This is the Custom House Tower. The Custom House has an observation deck on the top. If you look at the picture, it's that little green line quite near the top of it there. That is a deck. It is the highest unobstructed 360-degree view for the public in Boston. Now, the Custom House Tower was built in 1915. The Custom House was built long before then. Edgar Allan Poe worked there. In the subsequent years, it has been bought by Marriott and is filled with timeshares. But at various times during the day, the public are allowed to take the elevator up to the observation deck where you can see peregrine falcons ripping squirrels apart and feeding their babies from time to time. So the observation deck is only open at various times, and if you're 1 minute late, they will not let you go on the tour. So you have to be exactly on time. It costs about $5. Which is pretty cheap to get such a great view of the city. You can stay up there as long as you like. There are chairs up there. It's all wired in, so you can't jump off and commit suicide. You can't smoke up there either, but you can see the videos of the falcons and the hawks as well. I love this. It's so great. I highly recommend it to everyone. I was just there this week visiting it. So the Paul Revere House. Actually, this was built in 1680 by a wealthy slave owner. It was built on the site of the home of Increase and Cotton Mather, who are famous in Boston history, both for providing the smallpox vaccine and hanging the first witches. So Paul Revere's house was built here. He didn't own it for the entire time. He owned it for about 30 years, but he really didn't stay in it. He moved someplace else and rented it out for a while. It has been worked over and worked over and worked over many times, but even so, they used the same components over and over again, so that by doing a dendrochronological survey, they have decided that 90% of the original beams and lumber are still built in this house. It was saved from demolition by Revere's great-great-grandson, and made into a museum. It's $5. Right next door is the Pierce Hitchborn House, which is a Georgian house museum as well. And we'll be talking about more house museums later. An additional $4, but if you don't want to go in that, you can just go in the Revere House. There's a little gift shop next door. It's a ripoff. Don't go to the gift store. This is located in historic North Square. There is so much going on in this little area. And Mama Maria's restaurant is right next door, which I think is the best Italian restaurant in Boston. Highly recommend. So as I told you before, we will come back to the Arlington Street Church. The Arlington Street Church has the biggest collection of Tiffany glass windows in the entire world. Now, some of the windows are not complete because Louis Comfort Tiffany's factory burned down before he completed the last two windows. So this is the largest collection of glass. As you look at this glass window here, it is not actually little pieces of glass that are just soldered together with lead, as many stained glass windows are. They are layers of glass that are somehow adhered over to each other, used 5 different types of glass. And if you're lucky enough to be inside this church on a sunny day, you will be amazed at the impact of the sun coming through the window. Because in the past couple of years, they took the armor off the windows again, so the sunlight has been actually able to come into the church. This has actually been said to be the most progressive church in America. Every liberal cause that has come along, they have led the way, and they have paid the price for it on some occasions as well. You can actually enter the church for free, but you can get a tour from a docent for $5, and they will actually take you up into the steeple as well. So for $5, it's a pretty cheap and excellent tour, and it's right next to the public garden, so you can go to the SWAN boats, then go to the church. As a useless but interesting trivial note, the fire alarm was invented in Boston by the son of the minister who started this church back in the 1870s. If you see those little red firehouses that are attached to a telephone pole, they were invented here in Boston. And alarm number 1 is located near Old City Hall, near King's Chapel is one of those things that I was talking about earlier. So the Christian Science Church Tour. This church is the home base of the Mary Baker Eddy Church of Christ Scientists. There are so many things to see in this area. They have the reflecting pool. They have a tour of the church. They have one of the largest pipe organs in the world, 14,000 pipes, and they do one concert on Mondays every week. Obviously not now with the COVID, but when the COVID's over, you can go back and see them do the concerts. And one of the reasons why they do the concerts is to exercise the organ. The organ cannot be not used and not suffer. So they do some of these concerts sometime to exercise the organ. I actually happened to be there once when they were exercising the organ with a CD. So the CD was programmed to make the organ go through all of its paces, hit every note, and sing various songs. I personally think it was better than actually listening to a real concert. It really does take your heart away to hear that organ. And one of the most other amazing things that you see on this is the maparium. It's a giant globe of the world that you walk through circa 1935. So it's very interesting to see the geopolitical structure of the world back in those times. And it's very beautiful as well. $6, it's well worth the tour. The Old South Meeting House. I am a member of the Old South Meeting House. They have many kinds of lectures here. This building is incredibly important to Boston. It was built in 1729, and at one time it was the largest building in Boston and the most important. This is the focus of the American Revolution. This is where Sam Adams and the Sons of Liberty got together to rile up the crowds, to foment rebellion and discontent against the British. This was where the Boston Tea Party was started. It's about $7, $4 to $7, depending on your age, to get in. And it contains various exhibits inside at the rear and around the sides that talk about that period. So an interesting thing about this was that the original bell was sold in 1876 and the clock was stopped. However, in 2009, an original Paul Revere bell was acquired from a defunct Baptist church in Westboro, and it was put back up into that church steeple. I happened to go there for the ceremony. It was a pretty big deal. They had the crane lift the bell up, they put it in, they attached it, they chimed it. There were thousands of people nearby. They had bands and everything. It really stirred my little heart because as somebody who is very into the Revolutionary War, it really meant something to hear this church, this meeting house, toll its bell again. And, you know, they reenact the Boston Tea Party speeches every year on December 16th. They sell out every single year, every bench, standing room only. If you want to see how America started, this is the place to do it. So this is kind of like symbiotic trip here, the Encore Casino Water Shuttle. As you know, this guy named Wynn built a giant billion-dollar casino in Everett. Sadly, the casino is failing. But one of the things that they provided was a commuter boat that goes from various places in Boston right to the casino. And it's only $7 one way, so it's $14. One of the easiest ways to go is from Columbus Park. It is a long trip to get to the casino on this boat. These are converted yachts from like the 1960s. They're very comfortable. They're very retro. It's a great ride, well worth seeing. You go through the harbor again for $7, all the way to Everett. There's a gigantic garden, a custom-made garden at the casino with an art installation. So you don't even have to go in the casino if you don't want to. You can walk around and see all the cool things that are going on there, and there are a lot of cool things. So because the casino is not doing that well, I don't know if all the routes are still working, but the one from Columbus Park is, as far as I know. Again, another of my favorite things, very close to my heart, the old SWAN mill in Arlington. This is the oldest continuously operating factory in America. You can say 1684. It's not the same building as 1684. But they make oval frames using the same machines they used from the early 1800s. They employ one carpenter. They sell the frames. You can buy them. They're thousands of dollars. These are the frames in which the portraits of the presidents of the United States are put in the White House. The tour takes about an hour, and they will actually let you use the old lathes, or you can work the old lathes while they're making the oval frames. It's really quite the thing to see. And you can see the patterns and the frames and the blueprints that have all been kept for all these years. This building was going to be torn down in the 1960s, and it was saved by a local woman. They were going to put a parking lot for a trucking company in here, and every single thing was just in place. Every tool, the safe in the office, all the books of the people that they sold things to. It is so well preserved. It is well worth the $5 that you can go there and see it. The Nantucket Lightship. I am a member of the Nantucket Lightship Society. The Nantucket Lightship is a pretty cool thing. There were a number of lightships all around America. This one was the last one built in 1936. It was built to replace one that was run over by the RMS Olympic, which was the Titanic sister ship, in 1935 on its last tour to be broken up in England, and it killed 7 of the 9 men on board. The way the Nantucket Lightship worked was the ship would go off the shoals where there was no place to build a lighthouse, and it would have a foghorn and a light. So then that would protect ships coming across the Atlantic from running into the shoals. This ship was called the Liberty Lightship because, unlike the Statue of Liberty, this was really the first thing that everybody saw when they came to America. It is a short tour. They let you go in almost all the locations. You can go into the chain locker. You can go and see how the men lived. And the men lived on this ship for 90 days at a time, anchored in one place. And with that foghorn going off, some of those guys actually went crazy. The foghorn is set off once a year on August 14th on Lighthouse Day, and they only set it off at 1/4 of its volume because if they used its full volume, it would break every window in the harbor. They also light the light. It's the only time that they ever light the light, once a year. It spins around a couple of times. It's extremely bright. It can be seen from 40 miles away. And it's a great tour, and you can do a lot to save the ship. Right now, the ship's in dry dock. They're repainting the bottom and doing some work on it, but it'll be back at its pier in East Boston, near Piers Park, not too long from now. The Charles River Boat Company is also a marvelous thing to do. Anytime somebody says to me, I want to go on a duck tour, I say, forget the duck tour, it's $60. Go on the Charles River Boat Tour instead. It's much better, and it's only $15, and there's a bar on board. So you have to have your priorities straight. This tour, you can take 2 different tours. One tour goes up to Harvard University, up to the Lars Anderson Bridge, or the other tour is the architectural tour, which goes through the locks and into Boston Harbor. Both tours are really marvelous. They have people from Boston by foot who give a lecture while you're on the boat. They tell you what you're looking at. It's really quite the thing. If you're the type of person who likes architecture or history, then this is the tour for you. It's very comfortable. You can see from no matter where you are. And on the boat, you can actually stand up in the bow if you want to. If you don't want to sit down, you can stand in the bow and get the best possible view. For the money, this is one of the best values in Boston for touring. I can't think of a better value or tour for 15 bucks that you could get. King's Chapel in Boston, one of the first buildings made of stone in America. Those pillars that you're looking at, however, are made out of wood. They are painted to look like stone, but they're made out of wood. This was the first non-Puritan church in America, dating back to 1686. The current stone structure was built in 1749. And the amazing thing about this is that it was a wooden church, and they built the stone church around the wooden church, then dismantled the wooden church board by board, numbered each piece, bundled them up, and sent them up to their congregation in Lunenburg, Nova Scotia, where it remained in active service until vandals burned it down in 2001. Why? I don't know. I haven't been able to find out. But the church has since been rebuilt, but it's not the same one that was here back in 1686. This has a couple of tours. There's a burial ground on this. The only reason why this church was allowed to be built by the Puritans was because it was on a piece of what was considered garbage land, burial ground. The Puritans did not want an Anglican church here. They hated the Anglicans, but the Anglicans were able to prevail, and they built this church in a burial ground. And you can go down into the crypts. The church tour is $1. It's a very short tour. It's still pretty interesting. The crypt tour is $8. If you're the type of ghoulish person that likes to look at crypts, then this is for you. The first person born in America who died in America is buried here as well. I can't remember her name. It's a woman. As you can see in the background is Old City Hall as well. Again, as I said, this area has so much going on that it's really so exciting to stand there and think of all the amazing things that happened in this one little block. It is so well worth going there and walking around and seeing all the stuff that's there. The Old North Church, again, close to my heart because of its association with the Revolution. But there is so much more here to this church than just the Revolution. Built in 1723, it is still an operating church. It has the Old North Church Society is not just a church, but it's a complex of buildings, including an original chocolate shop where they make chocolate the way that it was made before the chocolate, the way we eat it today, was made, which, by the way, was invented in Boston in 1793 by Walter Baker. And you can still get Baker chocolate today. And he had a huge factory in Dorchester, but that's another story. Over 1,000 people are buried in the crypt down below, including a number of soldiers who fought at the Battle of Bunker Hill. This is the site where the 2 lanterns were hung to warn the countryside that the British regulars were advancing to take their arms. The place where Paul Revere landed, this is where he left. He was one of the people that put the lamps up there. Then he ran down the stairs, got in a little boat, rowed across the harbor, and got off on the other side. There is a little tiny plaque hidden on the other side of Boston Harbor to show where Paul Revere stepped out of his boat. What is also there is also extremely historic and well worth going because it's part of the Charlestown Navy Yard. The Tudor Wharves, the Constitution, all kinds of cool stuff is there. Well worth going to visit. $8 to go on this. There are 3 or 4 different buildings and things going on that you can visit and see. By the way, this is the first time that men tried to fly in America. One of the rectors jumped off the roof with homemade wings. It did not end well for him. He could not fly and he broke his legs. And a couple of people tried after that. They stretched a long wire from the top of the steeple and they flew down with these wings, making it look like they were flying. And the city of Boston passed a law that said no manned flight is allowed in the city anymore. Wow, on a hot summer day, this is a great place to be. The Colonnade Hotel rooftop pool. There are not many rooftop pools that are available for people to go to in Boston. There are not many pools that are really available, although there are a lot of water features in Boston. Another pool that you can go to is in the North End, where the site of the molasses flood took place. But the Colonnade rooftop pool is interesting because you can have drinks and sit at the pool, and the view is one of the best views of Boston that you will find anywhere. It's very expensive during the day, but after 4:30, it's only 10. After 5:30, it's only $10. They have showers, they have locker rooms, they have a full bar, they have the pool is heated, they have entertainment. This is, if you're, you know, I'm kind of an old dude, maybe this is getting a little bit beyond me now, but if you're a young person who likes to meet and greet, this is a cool place to go and hang out in the summertime. The Charles River Museum in Waltham, you can actually get to this by taking a bus from Boston. It's a long ride out to the Charles River Museum. This is a very important museum. This building that you're looking at was the first major factory in America. It was built by Lowell. It was called the American Manufacturing Company. He's the one who started Lowell and all the textile plants up there. The Slater Mill was actually the first mill. That's down in Rhode Island. This changed the way society worked in America, this entire mill. And eventually it fell into disuse. It was abandoned for decades. Finally, it was made into condos. And one small part of it was preserved to make into a museum. It's a $10 admission. There are all kinds of events here, and there are all kinds of many important things. The paper bag was invented by a woman in Boston. Actually, it's Springfield, but I like to say Boston. And the original paper bag making machine is here, and it still makes paper bags. They also have the Mergenthaler Hut type linotype machine, which was invented in New York by a Swede named Mergenthaler, which was to news in the 1870s what the internet is to us today. Clearly, one of the most important inventions ever made has been compared to the Gutenberg printing press, and they have a working model. I have to say that this museum is terrible. It's very dirty, it's very poorly curated, and they don't do a very good job of protecting the machines or the artifacts, but the things there are very important, and they're so well worth going to see that I will overlook all the bad parts. It also includes a watch museum because Waltham was once the watchmaking capital of the world. So, go check it out. The Harbor Islands in Boston is a jewel of Boston. There are like 28 islands in Boston. You can't go to all of them, but you can go to some of them. And the cruise that takes you there from Boston Harbor Cruises is only $15 for the round trip. Well worth the money. Going to George's Island, which you see in the top picture, is an excellent day trip. They have beaches, they have a snack bar, they have all kinds of caves and tunnels, and there's an old fort. There's all kinds of history. There are various tours. They have Civil War and Revolutionary War groups that reenact on the island. It is a great way to spend a day. And the intercity island, the inter-island ferries to the other islands are free. So you can stay here for an hour, get on a ferry and go to Spectacle Island, or get on a ferry and go to one of the other islands. And you can camp on these islands. You can actually reserve spots to camp on some of these islands for a week or so. Everything is bring in, there are no services. Now, the bottom tour is the Boston Lake tour. That tour is gone. It is very sad. This was the last lighthouse in America with a lighthouse keeper. It was a woman. She would give a tour of the lighthouse. She lived in that little house. However, the federal government has bought the lighthouse from Boston, and they have closed it down because they say the septic system does not meet standards. No one knows if they're ever going to open it up again. I hope they do. It was one of the best things in Boston. So, going to George's Island and taking an island tour is really excellent. I went to Pettick's Island. There were 1 million abandoned buildings on the island. And one day last year, I went into one of the abandoned buildings. I fell through the floor and almost died. So you have to be careful when you break into those abandoned buildings. So, various house tours. There are lots of historic houses in Boston. I'll just go over a few of them. The Otis House is a mansion, full-finished design, cost $15 to go in. It is a gigantic building that people used to live in. It does not have one single bathroom. Can you imagine how that must have been back in those days? Pretty rough. They have the big master bedroom in this house where everybody slept, even the servants, because at nighttime it was the only room that was heated. It took like something like 70 cords of wood to run this house for a year. I can't even imagine how they would gather and store 70 cords of wood. It's really pretty amazing. The Nicholas House is another house. It's on the very peak of Beacon Hill. This is an interesting house because Boston was a center of the China trade. And so this house is filled with all kinds of Chinese trade objects from that period. The Prescott House is one of the most amazing houses because of the incredible history associated with the people who lived there, notably the Prescott-Lindsay wedding. Prescott was one of the men who was the generals at Bunker Hill. Lindsay was a British captain who was in charge of the Beaver, who was shelling Bunker Hill from his ship. After the war, Prescott's daughter met Lindsay's son. They got married in this house. And to show that their enmity had passed, Prescott and Lindsay had their swords welded together to create one family. And it sits over the door of the living room. You can see it. I think it's so amazing that this sort of thing happens. I really get excited about it. The Blake House is the oldest private residence in Boston. It was a big farm back in the day in Eddie Everett Square. The Gibbston House is one of the most important tours in Boston. It is the only complete Victorian home in all of North America. It includes the same bathrooms and kitchens. The wallpaper is made out of leather. You can actually rent it out for weddings. $10, well worth the tour. It is a beautiful house. It is stepping back in time to go in there. The Shirley Eustace House is considered the best preserved house in all of Boston. It was built in 1747 in Dorchester. It's only $8, takes about an hour. My recommendation is go early in the day, don't get caught in that area after dark. The Fairbanks House is the oldest house in America. It's in Dedham, a little way out of Boston. You can take a bus to it. It's a $12 tour. It's very interesting because it's the oldest house in America and you can see how people lived back in those days. The Longfellow House in Cambridge on Brattle Street is also a great tour, has beautiful gardens, and this is where Washington had his headquarters back during the Revolutionary War. The African Mission House on Beacon Hill is also in a very historical area. It was built in 1806 on Joy Street. It's right next to the Appalachian Mountain Club headquarters. This is the centerpiece of the Black Heritage Trail, which is a 1.6-mile walk of African-American sites of interest on Beacon Hill. It costs about $8, and it provides a free tour, which is provided by the National Park Service. This is compared to the Freedom Trail, which is a 3-mile tour, and the only time a ranger gives the tour is the very first one at 8 o'clock. Massachusetts was one of the first places to bring slaves in 1638, but it was also the first place to abolish slavery in 1783, 3 years before English abolished its slavery. So in those days, Beacon Hill was kind of a abandoned area. It was like where cows grazed. And the blacks congregated on the north side of this area. As the property became more valuable, they were kind of pushed off into more undesirable locations, and people built their big mansions there, but the church remained. The Franklin Park Zoo. So this was designed by Frederick Law Olmsted. You can see it's like 10 or 14 bucks. It is an interesting zoo. The butterfly pavilion is actually very beautiful. The zoo was an immediate success when it opened, but it fell into disuse because it was in the middle of a very bad area on Columbia Road, American Legion Highway. It was the middle of a ghetto. In fact, they were thinking about closing the zoo permanently in the mid-'80s because nobody was going to. It only had like 35,000 people in 1 year. Now, 500,000 I put $500,000, but that was a mistake on my part. 500,000 visitors a year come to the zoo, and to see many of the great exhibits. Now, currently, they're putting on a COVID light show, which is really spectacular and extravagant. You can actually walk through these giant animals, which are made out of LED lights. It's quite the thing. The IMAX Theater is another interesting and low-priced thing, $10 to get in. It's the largest screen in Boston, 60 feet high, with the best sound system. It's dedicated. It is part of the dedicated aquarium complex, but it is a separate price. The aquarium is much, much more expensive. It's great to view movies here. I've seen a couple of excellent movies here. They do show some big blockbusters, but mostly they show movies about Arctic adventures or things of natural experience. The old State House is a beautiful building and a beautiful site, but it's kind of a disappointing tour. It's $10 to go in, and the history of the building is phenomenal, but there's really not that much inside. The balcony that you see there is where they first read the Declaration of Independence, and right below that balcony is where the Boston Massacre happened. Inside the building, there are various rooms where they have presentations that go on of historical things that take place in Boston from time to time. This building was saved. It was going to be bought by a group in Chicago in the 1870s and dismantled brick for brick and rebuilt in Chicago. But the people threw their arms up and they said, we can't lose this building, so they saved it. This is the Mass Horticultural Society in Wellesley. This actually is, there's no easy way to get here from Boston. You actually have to drive there, but it's well worth it. It's beautiful. It's many gardens. They have all kinds of plants and trees, and they have many events. This place could be hired out for weddings. That mansion that you see in the background is completely abandoned. You can't go inside it, but the grounds themselves are available for weddings. The Mass Horticultural Society are the people who invented the Concord grape that we're very familiar with today. They made it by interbreeding various breeds of grapes. The Children's Museum, I put it here, it's $17. That's not that cheap, but it's $1 on Fridays. And it's located on Fort Point. There's a lot of things to see and do in Fort Point. And you can see it's right next to the giant Hood bottle, which was down in Taunton for many years and was brought up to Boston and preserved by Hood. And you can still buy hot dogs there. This museum has one of the largest collections of doll houses in America. And if you like doll houses, and I do, it's well worth going to see them in this museum. That is all I have to say about cheap things in Boston. I very much appreciate your attention. I hope I didn't get too excited about it. Anybody who has any questions or comments or criticisms, now is the time to make them. I look forward to hearing anything you might have to say.